That night, Preston Hale knelt before the head of New York's underworld, not because he was arrested, but because he had chosen to offer his daughter as a bargaining chip to save his own life, the man who called himself her father. For 22 years, that daughter had lived in the shadows, bearing scars no dress could conceal, and the coldest criminal in Manhattan was the only one to place his jacket on her trembling shoulders. This is the story of a confessor, and the one who acknowledges their darkness. Watch until the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. The photo was taken at 2:47 a.m. There was no accompanying message, no explanation, just a JPEG file sent from a phone number that was deactivated 3 minutes later, a detail Damian Virelli recognized immediately because he had used that trick enough times to recognize it in the dark. He looked at the screen. Take a look. Then he placed the phone down on the marble table with frightening precision. No force, no shaking, not a sound. Just the soft click of plastic against the cold stone, as quiet as someone's last breath. The office on the 28th floor of the Virelli Holdings building was utterly silent. Rain pounded against the glass like bullets against steel. Below, Manhattan continued to live, continued to move, continued to be unaware, as it always was when blood was spilled in its dark corners. Dominic Caruso, Damian's right-hand man for 12 years, a man who had handled dozens of inexplicable situations, stood on the other side of the table. He stared at his boss without blinking, not out of curiosity, but because he had long since learned that Damian Virelli's moments of silence were his most dangerous. "Luca?" Dominic asked. A single word. Enough to know. Damian didn't reply immediately. He stood up, walked to the window, gazed down at the wet city below with the eyes of someone counting. Not counting money. Not counting days, counting the price someone would have to pay. "FDR Drive," he said last. "They left him in the car." Dominic closed his eyes for a second. No more. Then he opened them. "I need a name." "Me too." Luca Virelli is the younger brother that Damian promised his father he would protect. That was the only promise Damian Virelli ever truly believed in, not oaths to business partners, not commitments to politicians at dinners and restaurants without publicly available menus, not pacts with other tycoons in a system built on a foundation of distrust. Just that promise. Said to his father a week before the old man died of pancreatic cancer in a hospital bed smelling of disinfectant and wilted flowers. "I'll keep Luca safe, Dad." Damian kept his word for 9 years. Until tonight. Luca was the money collector, not because he lacked the talent for other work, but because he enjoyed it. He enjoyed confrontation. He enjoyed looking into people's eyes when they realized they had run out of options. It was a dangerous tendency in a family already full of dangerous men, and Damian had warned him more times than he wanted to remember. "Luca, don't take it personally." Luca left after they paid. No performance. "Luca, you're not the father. You don't need to prove anything." But 29-year-old Luca Virelli didn't listen. Because at 29, you still believe your family name is impenetrable armor. Preston Hale taught him a lesson in return with a surgical knife. They found the name within 48 hours. It wasn't an easy 48 hours. 48 hours of brief phone calls, meetings in dark underground parking garages, money transferred to accounts that would vanish from the banking system before dawn. Damian didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He sat at the center of the network like a spider waiting, receiving information and relaying orders in a voice so flat that one couldn't read his inner emotions. Dominic was more worried about that than if Damian were to smash things. Smashing things means he's processing his emotions. This kind of calmness means he's taken emotions out of the equation entirely. And an emotionless Damian Virelli is the most terrifying version of that man. Preston Hale. When that name reached Damian, he read it 3 times. Not because he didn't recognize it, but because he recognized it all too well. Preston Hale. 58 years old. Hale Capital Management. The Midtown building with his name on the black bronze door. 8 appearances on the cover of Forbes magazine. The man who donated $3 million to a children's hospital construction fund in Brooklyn last year. The man who, 18 months earlier, approached Virelli Syndicate with a loan that couldn't be obtained from any legitimate bank. Because the FBI was building a securities fraud investigation file thick enough to bury anyone. Damian lent him money. That's normal. Luca came to collect the money. That's normal. But Preston Hale, instead of paying the debt, decided that he himself was too important to disappear, and that the person who came to collect his money was important enough to use as a message to the Virelli syndicate. He didn't know that the person collecting the money was the son of the Virelli family. That didn't help him at all, but it changed everything. Damian met Preston Hale at 10 o'clock on Wednesday night at a private cigar lounge on the 46th floor of a building on the Upper West Side, a place only men with enough money and enough secrets to keep each other confidential were allowed to enter. Damian arrived alone. Dominic wasn't there. There were no guards. Just him in his charcoal gray vest, without a tie, his dark brown eyes colder than anything in the heated room. Preston sat in a black leather chair, a glass of cognac in his hand, his face flushed in the manner of men accustomed to fine liquor and the cool air of success. Around him were three other men, not friends, just like-minded individuals seated close enough to be considered present. When Damian walked in, the room changed. No one said anything. But everyone felt it, the invisible shift in pressure when someone carrying the weight of violence entered a space meant for subtlety. Two of the three men stood up and left without being asked. The third glanced over his shoulder toward Preston as if asking permission. Preston nodded. The man left too. Now there are only two of us left. Damian sat down opposite Preston Hale without being invited. He didn't pull out a chair, adjust his posture, or do anything to show preparation or common courtesy. He simply sat down as if the chair had always been his. "You know why I'm here," Damian said. Not a question. Preston set down his glass of cognac. His hand trembled slightly. Damian noticed it and noted it, not with satisfaction but with disappointment. Because a man who trembles at the start of a conversation is a man who will say what he thinks he needs to say to survive, and not necessarily the truth. "I didn't know Luca Virelli was his brother," Preston began. "That's irrelevant." "For me, yes. If only I knew—" "If you had known," Damian interrupted, his voice as flat as a frozen lake, "you would have killed someone else instead. The difference is that my younger brother, it's not about whether he knows or not." Preston remained silent. The rain continued to fall outside the window. "I don't have enough money to pay," Preston said finally. "Not right now. The FBI is—" "I know what the FBI is doing," Damian said. "I know exactly what they have. I know your Cayman Islands account numbers. I know the names of the partners you sold insider shares to. I know the real amount your investment fund has lost over the past 2 years while reporting to investors that everything was growing." He paused. "You don't have cash, but you have something else." Preston Hale looked into Damian Virelli's eyes, and for the first time in years, the man felt genuine fear. Not fear of the FBI, not fear of bankruptcy, not fear of losing everything he had built. Fear of the man sitting opposite him. Damian waited. And Preston Hale, in a moment of utter despair, said something he would regret for the rest of his life. "I have a daughter." Damian drove home in silence. Dominic called 3 times. He didn't answer. What he had just agreed to, he sat with it as the rain lashed against the windshield and the Manhattan streetlights drifted by in hazy streaks of yellow and red. What he had just agreed to wasn't what he really wanted. What did he want? He wasn't quite sure. He wanted Preston Hale to be terrified. He wanted him to lose sleep. He wanted him to realize that every decision from now on would be made in the shadow of the Virelli name. But a girl? A 22-year-old girl offered as a bargaining chip by her own father? Damian thought of Luca. He thought of the way his younger brother had laughed. A loud, self-centered laugh. The kind of laugh of someone who never learned to keep a safe distance from life. He thought of the photo on his phone and the smell of the car, rain and blood, that he had never actually smelled, but his brain kept conjuring up. He agreed not because he wanted Aurora Hale. He agreed because this was the most complete way to destroy Preston Hale. Not just financially, not just legally, but also emotionally. To take away what he loved most. To make it his own. That's at least what Damian was telling himself in the car. The wedding took place 2 weeks later. There was no press announcement, no high society guests, no champagne reception and speeches about hope and the future. just an old priest who had known the Virelli family for decades, 12 armed guards in suits standing along the walls, and candlelight casting a light in the Long Island mansion that Damian always found artificial. Aurora Hale entered in a worn, white lace dress that seemed to belong to another era, not hers, not chosen by her. Her face was so pale it was almost translucent in the candlelight. Her dark hair was neatly and practically styled, lacking any grace. Her eyes, a pale gray like the sky before a storm, stared straight ahead, never once glancing to the right where her father stood. Damian stood at the head of the room and watched her approach. He noticed it immediately. She wasn't walking. She existed. Each step was set with the control of someone who had practiced moving through rooms without attracting too much attention, without taking up too much space, without giving anyone a reason to notice her. It was the kind of body language not learned in manners classes, the kind etched in by prolonged fear. Damian was a human reader. He'd been doing it for years to survive, and in the 3 seconds he watched Aurora Hale approach, he read enough to make something unnamed twist in his chest, but he pushed it aside. Now wasn't the time. When the priest read the section on free will and consent, Damian deliberately avoided eye contact with her. Not because he felt guilty, but because he didn't want to see anything in it. As the gold ring slid onto her finger, he leaned down. Not to kiss, to speak. Low enough for only her to hear, his breath brushed against her earlobe like a cold streak. "Your father traded you for his life," he said. "Welcome to my home." Aurora didn't look up, but her hand, the small hand in his, clenched again. Briefly, as if inside that body trying to occupy as little space as possible, something was still resisting. Damian let go of her hand. Preston Hale stood in the corner of the room and wept. No one asked him why. The Virelli villa in Long Island rises atop a cliff, as if built to hold secrets. 3 stories of gray granite, non-reflective glass, 17 bedrooms, a walled garden, and far enough from the coast that the sound of the waves at night is like the breathing of something very large and very old. A security team patrols on a schedule. Cameras monitor the blind spots of every fence. The 12-foot iron gate cannot be opened from the inside unless a code is provided. Aurora knew that the moment the car pulled through the gate, not a home, a beautiful prison, but still a prison. She sat in the main living room and looked around while the maid carried her luggage upstairs. Not much. 2 average-sized suitcases, far less than what a woman from a family like hers was supposed to have. The maid, a middle-aged Italian woman named Maria, looked at her with a look Aurora was familiar with, a mixture of curiosity, pity, and a feeling of not knowing what to do with both. Damian didn't follow them into the house right away. He stood outside in the rain for 15 minutes, the phone clutched between his ear and shoulder, speaking to Dominic in a voice low enough that no one could hear. When he came in, his hair wet, his shirt collar stained dark with rainwater, he looked at Aurora sitting upright on the sofa like someone waiting for a doctor's appointment and said nothing. "Are you hungry?" he asked last. Aurora shook her head. "Maria will show you the room. You can move around the house freely. The basement and my study are off limits." "Okay," she said. Her voice was softer than Damian had expected, not weak, but deliberately quiet, the kind that had been honed through years of practice. "Is there anything else you need to ask?" She was silent for a moment. "What do you want from me?" Damian looked at her, a direct question. No pleading, no excuses. Just a direct question, with the faint courage of someone who has nothing left to lose. "I want your father to know that everything he thinks he has now belongs to me," Damian said. "You are just a part of it." Aurora nodded slowly. She nodded in the way someone is listening to information, processing it, storing it somewhere in their memory for later reference, not in the way someone is hurt by it. That once again drew more attention from Damian than he would have liked. He turned away before realizing he was staring for too long. The wedding night did not unfold in any conventional sense of the word. Damian drank whiskey in his office until 11 o'clock at night, skimmed through financial reports he didn't really read, signed off on things Dominic would handle later, letting work fill the space in his head in the way it had always done since his father's death. Around midnight, he went upstairs. The master bedroom was absurdly large. Damian had lived there alone long enough to no longer notice it. Dark hardwood floors, Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, a California king bed with pristine white sheets that no one but him had slept on in the past 3 years. Aurora stood beside the bed. She's still wearing her wedding dress. Her hands trembled. It wasn't a slight tremor. It was the kind of tremor someone trying not to tremble and failing, their whole body shaking with small, uncontrollable tremors. Damian walked in and stopped when he saw her. "Haven't you changed your clothes yet?" I can't." Her voice broke mid-sentence. "The buttons are on the back. I can't." She didn't finish the sentence. It wasn't necessary. Damian understood. The row of pearl buttons running down the back of the dress, the design beautiful in the catalog photo, and the hellish reality of it alone. He walked up behind her, and when his hand touched her shoulder, Aurora spun around with a sharp recoil, her body reacting before her brain could process it, and in that instant, her face opened completely like a book without a cover. "Don't be angry. This is not meant to be dismissive. Pure fear. A primitive, old-fashioned fear, hardened by repeated use." "Don't touch me," she said. Her voice wasn't pleading. That was the strangest thing. It was commanding, even though her whole body was trembling. "Please don't touch me." Something in Damian's chest moved. He took a step back, and Aurora Hale, also recoiled, her high heels clicking on the wooden floor, stepping back until her back touched the wall beside the window. She stood there, breathing heavily, her hands clasped together in a defensive gesture that should never be taken for granted. Damian did not move. They stared at each other for the longest 3 seconds of that night. Then he turned and walked to the wardrobe. He opened it. He took out an old flannel shirt he hadn't worn in months. He threw it onto the bed without saying a word. "Change that," he said. "I'll sleep in another room." He had just reached the door when he heard the sound of tearing fabric. It wasn't the sound of deliberate tearing, the tearing of old fabric and buttons too small and hands trembling too much. The tearing of something that had long been at the limit of its endurance. He turned reflexively. The back of the dress had ripped open. And Damian Virelli stood there, his hand gripping the doorframe, looking at something he never wanted to see and would never be able to avoid seeing again after this moment. Her back was a map of violence, raised scars on the shoulders, not surgical scars, not accident scars, straight and even, like leather straps or something similar, scattered small burns along the flanks, round and deep, like the tip of a cigarette pressed down while the skin was still alive, an old bruise turning yellowish green on the lower back, a straight 7 or 8 centimeter long scar just above the left hip, knife. Nothing else made that scar. Aurora felt the gaze. She bent over and fell, not as if she had lost her balance, but as if she had no strength left to stand, and her knees struck the wooden floor with a dry thud. Her hands clasped to her chest, trying to pull the torn piece of her dress to cover herself, and her voice broke in a way entirely different from what he had heard all night. "Don't use the rope," she said, and those words weren't directed at Damian. They were directed at someone who wasn't in the room, someone who had been in the room far too many times before. "I'll be good this time. I promise. I'll—" "Stop." Damian didn't realize he'd said it until he heard his own voice, hoarse, low, with something cracking beneath the surface. She was silent, trembling. He didn't approach immediately. He stood still for 10 seconds, counting in his head, controlling his own breathing, letting something in his chest do what it needed to do without interference. Then he took off his vest and walked slowly towards her, placing it on her shoulders from behind without touching her skin. The heavy fabric fell onto Aurora's shoulders. She didn't move. Damian sat down on the floor beside her. Not standing, looking down, not kneeling before her, just sitting on the cold wooden floor as if he had nowhere better to be at that moment. His hands rested on his lap. He didn't move. "Who did this to her?" he asked. It's strange. He asked the question as if he didn't know the answer, as if there was some possibility on this world's list of sins that he hadn't considered. Aurora didn't answer immediately. She sat on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest, Damian's black vest covering her bare back, and gazed into the space between them with the eyes of someone weighing whether the truth would be of any use. Finally, she said, 2 words. "My father." Throughout his life, Damian Virelli commanded things he wouldn't even think about in broad daylight. He looked men straight in the eye, begging for their lives, and didn't flinch. He built his empire on a foundation of deliberate coldness and the capacity to contain violence without it consuming him. But those two words, spoken by the woman sitting on the floor of his room with a back covered in scars, did something that nothing in the past 20 years had done. It broke something. Not exactly his heart. Damian wasn't sure he still had that kind of heart in the conventional sense, but something harder. The internal categorization system he'd spent decades building, the one that divided the world into parts that could be dealt with and parts that could be ignored. Preston Hale knelt before him and wept for his daughter. And all that time, throughout those 2 weeks, through that somber wedding, through this nighttime drive, he never once asked himself how she felt. Part of that is because he doesn't want to know. Because knowing will change everything. And now he knows. "Sleep in bed," he said finally. His voice sounded strange to himself. Not cold, not commanding, just a human voice. "I won't be in this room." He stood up, stepped out the door. He stopped, his hand on the doorknob, his back turned to her. Aurora. He had never called her by her name before, not in the past 2 weeks. She had always been just the girl in his head, or Hale's daughter, or no name at all. No one in this house will touch you. He didn't wait for her answer. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Damian sat in his second-floor office until 3 in the morning. No work, no drinking, just sitting. The phone rang. Dominic again. He looked at the screen for a moment, then answered the call this time. "How's Preston Hale doing?" he asked instead of greeting him. "It's stable," Dominic said. "The FBI hasn't made any new moves. The Cayman account is still there. He wants us—" "Not yet." "Stop." "Damian, are you okay?" "Find me everything about Aurora Hale," he said. "School, hospital, doctors, every time she left her father's apartment, everyone she contacted, everything." Dominic fell silent for a moment. "All right," he said, and asked no further questions, because after 12 years he knew when Damian Virelli needed answers and when he needed space to find them himself. Damian put the phone down. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall. Inside the house, upstairs, Aurora Virelli, Aurora Hale, lay alone on the wide bed in the darkness, wearing the old flannel shirt of the man she feared most in her life, and for the first time in many years, no one stood on the other side of the door waiting to come in. No one. The only sound was the distant sound of waves below the cliffs. And the next morning, when Maria brought the coffee up to the room, she would find a piece of paper neatly placed on the bedside table, handwritten, concisely, in black ink on white paper. "She is safe here. No one is allowed into this room without permission. DV." And downstairs, Damian Virelli was sifting through Aurora's hospital records. 4 emergency room visits in 8 years, each with different explanations. Each time Preston Hale stood beside her with the worried smile of a father and stories of stairs and bicycles and ordinary accidents. And something inside him shifted from icy cold to something far more dangerous. It's not fire. Purpose. And in the darkest corner of the office, in a drawer locked with a combination lock, beneath checks and agreements signed in red ink, Preston Hale had just acquired another enemy. The most dangerous enemy he could imagine was not because Damian Virelli wanted his money, not because he wanted his empire, not because of Luca's blood debt. But now, Damian has a reason. And that was just the first night. The next morning began with the smell of coffee and an armed silence. Maria set the tray down on the kitchen table at 7:15 and stepped back as if she had learned that this room in the morning was not a place to linger longer than necessary. Damian stood at the window overlooking the garden, coffee cup in hand, shoulders slightly hunched, the posture of someone who had been up all night and refused to admit it. His hair was uncombed, no tie. His white shirt untucked seemed to be the only thing standing between him and the utter chaos. Dominic sat at the head of the table with a stack of papers in front of him, his eyes showing the look of someone who hadn't slept enough for days. "The girl's file," Dominic said when he heard Damian's footsteps returning from the window. "I read it all night." "I know you've read it, but there's something you haven't seen." Dominic flipped to a page in the stack of papers. 2019. She was 20 years old, admitted to NYU Langone, diagnosed with fractures of the 4th and 5th left ribs, and soft tissue injuries to the chest. Preston Hale told the doctor she fell down the stairs while doing yoga. The attending physician was someone who had seen Hale at 3 previous charity events. No further investigation. No report. Damian set his coffee cup down. Is there anything else? 2021, private clinic in the Upper East Side. Infected burn on the right side. Preston accompanied her. Paid in cash. No insurance record. Dominic turned another page. And here's the interesting part. In 2020, there was one time Aurora Hale went to St. Luke's emergency room by herself. No Preston, no driver. She took a taxi there, told the attending nurse she wanted to speak with a social worker. Damian looked up. And Preston Hale showed up 20 minutes later. I don't know how he found out. He spoke with the chief physician for 15 minutes. Then Aurora was taken home without seeing any social workers. Dominic closed the file. That man has connections everywhere. It's gone. Dominic stared at his boss for a long second. Damian, that girl is now his wife. I know. No. Sir, no in a legal sense. I'm asking in a different sense. What would you do about that? Damian didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a chair, sat down opposite Dominic, and looked directly into the face of the man who had been with him long enough to be allowed to ask directly. I don't know, and he said finally, and it was the most honest answer Dominic had heard from him in months. Dominic nodded slowly. While he's investigating, Preston Hale is meeting with a lawyer at the Greenberg & Associates office at 10 a.m. this morning. It may be related to the transfer of assets. Monitor. It has been arranged. Footsteps on the stairs. Both men remained silent. Aurora appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:45, wearing Damian's flannel shirt, mid-thigh length, sleeves rolled up 3 times, a wide, asymmetrical collar. Her hair was uncombed, falling over her shoulders in a way Damian was sure she didn't intend to look. Barefoot on the stone floor. And her pale gray eyes glanced from Damian to Dominic before pausing briefly before she decided to enter the room. Dominic stood up. Mrs. Virelli, he said, with practiced politeness. Aurora looked at him as if trying to find a trap in that greeting. She couldn't find one. She nodded slightly. Dominic Caruso, Damian said without looking up. My underboss, he knows everything. How much does all that mean? She asked. The question was direct. Again, direct. Damian noticed that, the way she walked into the room and immediately began assessing the territory, checking boundaries, figuring out how much information she had compared to those around her. Not the behavior of someone trained to be compliant, the behavior of a survivalist. That's enough, Dominic said. Aurora went to the coffee machine. She poured herself a cup without asking anyone, finding her way around an unfamiliar kitchen with the pragmatism of someone accustomed to fending for herself in unfamiliar environments. Dominic looked at Damian. Damian didn't look back. She drank her coffee standing at the kitchen counter, her back not completely turned toward them, far enough away to maintain distance, close enough to hear everything. Can I go outside? She asked. What does going outside mean? Damian asked. The garden. I can see the garden from the window. Damian looked at Dominic. Dominic shrugged slightly. Okay, Damian said. Someone will go with us. Is it necessary? Necessary. Aurora looked at the coffee cup. Okay. And that was the entire first conversation of the morning. Brief, practical, neither warm nor hostile. Just 2 people learning to share the air without stepping on each other. But Damian noticed one thing when she turned away. She didn't ask about her father. She didn't ask where he was. She didn't ask what would happen to him. Not a word. He didn't know how to interpret that. The garden was bigger than Aurora had imagined. A 1/4 hectare of greenery is neatly trimmed in a classic style, with low-growing trees lining the stone pathways and beds of black roses that are no longer in bloom. The sea breeze carries a salty scent strong enough to be felt on the tongue. The November sky is a dull porcelain white. The bodyguard, Carlo, stood 7 steps behind her, close enough to intervene but far enough to feign invisibility. He was young, 25, 26, with an expressionless face and the posture of someone trained to be invisible. Aurora walked along the stone path unhurriedly. Her bare feet remained on the ground. She hadn't worn shoes, and that wasn't carelessness. The grass was wet underfoot, the earth cold, the wind blowing. She stopped at the far end of the garden, where a tall wooden fence separated the property from the cliff, and peered through a gap down to the seashore below. Waves crash against the rocks. Crash, crash, crash. There's no rhythm, just force. Carlo stopped 6 steps behind her. Is the sea deep? She asked without turning around. Below the cliff? Carlo paused. I don't know exactly. Just deep. How high is the cliff? This time Carlo hesitated longer. About 20 meters, Mrs. Virelli. Just call me Aurora, son, Aurora said. Call me Aurora. Carlo didn't answer, but she sensed a slight shift in his posture, something between relief and embarrassment. She turned around. I'm not planning to jump, she said bluntly, looking him in the eye. If that's what you're planning. Carlo didn't move. All I see is the sea. She looked back over the fence. I've always lived in Manhattan. There's no sea there. They stood there for a while longer in silence that was neither entirely comfortable nor entirely uncomfortable. Every morning Aurora can come out here, Carlo said finally, clearly deciding that was the most useful thing to say. Aurora nodded once. Thank. The call came in at 11 o'clock in the morning. Damian was in his second-floor office, reading a report from the team monitoring Preston Hale. The meeting with the lawyer had taken place, and what they'd heard from the man sitting at the next desk with a listening device in his tie hadn't pleased him. Preston was trying to transfer assets to the name of a friend's fictitious son-in-law in Delaware. He was preparing to flee. The phone vibrates. An unfamiliar number. Men. Damian. Preston Hale's voice, but not the voice of the man kneeling on the floor of the cigar lounge last week. This was the voice of someone who had slept, thought, and recalculated. We need to talk. Which number are you calling from? A prepaid phone. Bought this morning. A brief pause. I know you're watching me. Well, you should know that. My son-in-law, Preston said, isn't a good idea. He's under a separate tax investigation. I wouldn't hire him. Damian sat back and let it sink in. Preston was letting him know he was being watched. That was either incredibly naive or tactical, the way to put it. I have nothing to hide, without actually saying it. What do you want, Preston? I want to see my daughter. Damian held the phone a centimeter from his ear. He stared at the wall in front of him. For a moment he saw the hospital records again. 2019, 2020, 2021. Arnott. Damian, Arnott. She's my daughter. She's my wife, Damian said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't anger, colder than anger. And if you call this number or any other number connected to me to inquire about Aurora, I'll make sure the documents I have reach the right person within 24 hours. Do you understand? A sigh came from the other end of the line, long, heavy. I'm not as bad a person as you think, Preston said in the end. Damian hung up the phone. He sat there for another minute, staring at the phone in his hand. Then he stood up, went to the door, walked down the hallway, and stopped in front of Aurora's room. Knock on the door. There was no immediate reply. Then, come in. He opened the door. Aurora sat at a small table by the window with a book in her hand, not reading, just holding it, as if she needed something to hold on to. She looked at him with a silently appraising gaze that he was beginning to realize was her default. Your father just called me, Damian said bluntly. He wants to see you. Her expression remained unchanged. Not a single muscle in her face twitched. What did you say to him? Arnott. Stop, briefly. Did he ask for my opinion? She asked. Arnott. So why are you here talking to me? Damian opened his mouth, closed it. Fair question. He didn't have a good answer, and that in itself was a kind of answer. I think you should know, he said finally. Aurora looked at him for another second. Then she turned back to the window. Thank you, she said, and her voice was neither grateful nor sarcastic, just a simple fact. Damian left. He closed the door behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment, his back against the wall, listening to the sound of the sea echoing from below. He just went into her room to notification for her, not to command, not to control, to inform. As if her opinion mattered in this decision. When did that begin? Bess. Their first dinner together was a silent disaster. Maria cooked pasta, simple, practical, the kind of food that doesn't need any praise. They sat at opposite ends of a long dining table that could seat 12, with the distance between them like another room. Aurora ate in small bites, placing her fork down between each bite. She sat up straight in an uncomfortable way, not the posture of someone taught good manners, but the posture of someone learning to take up the least amount of space possible. Damian ate faster. He looked down at his plate most of the time. No one said anything for the first 15 minutes. "What are you studying?" Damian asked abruptly. Aurora looked up. Clearly, she hadn't expected that question. "Art," she said after a pause. "Columbia." "I didn't graduate." "Why not?" She looked at him as if she were wondering whether he really wanted to know or was just filling in the silence. "My father wants me to stay home," she said, "after my sophomore year." Damian continued eating. He didn't ask any further questions. "What are you studying?" Aurora asked, sounding more like a question in return than genuine curiosity. "I didn't go to university." "He doesn't look like someone who's never been to university." Damian looked up. There was a fleeting expression in his eyes, not exactly surprise, but close to it. "My father said the school of life is better than school," he said. "He was right and wrong about different things." "Has he ever been right about anything?" The question didn't come from a polite social setting. It came from something more genuine. Damian put down his fork. "He said that people will remember more what you do with power than how you got it," Damian said. Aurora looked at him. She looked as if she were measuring something. "Do you believe that?" "I'm trying." Another silence, different from the previous ones, less tense. "I want to return your shirt," she said, changing the subject abruptly. "Keep it." "I don't have many clothes here, but I have enough to—" "Keep it," he repeated. "Maria will arrange for someone to bring it to you." Aurora looked down at the plate. "You don't need to do that." "I know." And those two words, ended the conversation in a way that neither of them fully understood. Day 3 began with a mistake. Dominic arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning with the face of someone bringing bad news. Damian read it from the way he closed the door, not forcefully, but decisively, in the manner of someone wanting to make sure no one was eavesdropping. "Go ahead and speak," Damian said. "There's someone inside the house." Silent. "Mean?" "Someone has been reporting Preston Hale's schedule for the past 3 days." Dominic placed a piece of paper on the table, a printout of a phone call with the number redacted. "This call was made from inside the estate at 6 o'clock yesterday evening, 17 minutes. Damian looked at the piece of paper. "From which number?" "Maria's phone." The name struck him in a way he wasn't entirely prepared for, because Maria had been here for 12 years, been here before he had his empire, been here when his father was alive, and the house still smelled of cigarette smoke and real Italian dinners instead of things cooked to fill the space. "Are you sure?" "The number that called matches the prepaid phone Preston used yesterday," Dominic said. "I'm sure." Damian stood up. He opened the office door. He called Maria's name. The woman emerged from the end of the hallway. 60 years old, salt and pepper hair, wearing her usual apron, her eyes instantly reading the situation. She didn't run. She didn't try to explain. She simply walked with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had made a decision before entering the room. "Maria," Damian said. "Mr. Damian." "Did Mr. Preston call you?" Maria stood still. 1 second. 2. Then, "He's worried about Aurora." "That's not the answer to my question." "He called first," Maria said. "On the wedding day. He asked me to keep an eye on her. He said she was vulnerable. He told me what kind of person you are." Damian didn't move. "And she trusts him." "I've known you since you were a child, Damian." Maria's voice changed, no longer the maid's voice. It was the voice of someone who had seen too much over too many years to pretend. "I know what you do. I know how people fear you. That girl," Damian interrupted, his voice dropping in a way that silenced Dominic in the corner of the room instantly, "bears scars on her back inflicted by the very man she trusted. That man worries about her." He paused. "Not me." Maria looked at him, and Damian saw it. The moment something in her head reprocessed, recalculated, changed. "I don't know that," she said softly. She knows now. 1 second is long. "You're leaving today," Damian said. "Dominic will handle the salary and paperwork. You don't need to contact Preston Hale or anyone in his family again. Do you understand?" Maria nodded. Her eyes were red and swollen, but she didn't cry. "That girl," she said before turning away. "Keep an eye on her." She left the room. Damian watched until the sound of footsteps faded at the end of the corridor. Then he turned to Dominic. "Preston knows I'm gathering information about him," he said. "He's trying to buy himself more time." "I know." "Tighten the investigation. I want to know where he eats breakfast, what time he goes to bed, what he wears when he goes out, everything." "And Aurora?" Damian looked out the window. "Don't say anything to her about Maria." Aurora found out about Maria that afternoon. Not because anyone said so, but because it's the kind of thing people who've lived long enough in houses with secrets learn to recognize. Maria's car wasn't in the parking lot anymore. The small room at the end of the side hallway had its door open, and the air was empty in a way that was peculiar to a space that had just been emptied. She found Damian in his office. "Knock on the door. Don't wait for an answer. Open it." He was on the phone. He glanced up at her, a fleeting expression, not anger, closer to something akin to worry, then said into the phone, "I'll call back." He hung up. "Where did Maria go?" Aurora asked. Damian put the phone down on the table. "She no longer works here." "Why?" "An internal problem." Aurora stepped further into the room. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, judging, calculating, searching for the unspoken. "He fired her because of me," she said. Not a question. Damian did not reply. "She reported it to my father," she continued, her voice flat. "That's why." "Aurora." "I'm not stupid, Damian." It was the first time she had called him by his name. He noticed it, not because it was special, but because it wasn't. She said his name as if she had done it many times before, as if his name carried no more weight than any other word. "I know you're not stupid," he said. "Then don't treat me like that." She stopped in the middle of the room, neither sitting down nor moving forward. "How long has she been here?" 12 years. Something flickered across Aurora's face. Not exactly guilt, but something related to it. "Because of me, he lost someone who had been working for him for 12 years. Because she violated trust. Because she thought he would harm me." Aurora looked him straight in the eye. She wasn't entirely wrong to worry. Damian stood up. Not to approach. Just to stand up, so that he and she were on the same plane instead of him sitting and her standing. "I won't harm you," he said. He said it as if it needed no explanation. "It's not necessary. With you, it's not necessary." Her voice changed, not rising, not breaking, just carrying a heavier weight. "You weren't the kind of person who grew up in an apartment where every time the door opened, you wondered how bad the day was going to be. You didn't have to learn to read footsteps on the floor, fast or slow, heavy or light, to know if you had time to run to the bathroom and lock the door. You weren't—" She stopped, swallowed. "You're not me. So when you say, 'I will not harm her,' and if you think that's enough, well, it's not. It's not." The room was silent. Outside the window, the wind changed direction, and the trees in the garden all leaned towards the east. Damian looked at her. He really looked. Not judging, not analyzing, not searching for weaknesses to exploit. He looked in a way he didn't allow himself to do often because it required something he wasn't sure he had much of. "You're right," he said. Aurora didn't seem to have expected that. She watched him blink once. Just once. "I can't erase what happened before you came here," he said. "I can't change why this marriage exists. But while you're in this house, no one will harm you. That's not an empty promise. It's something I can guarantee, and I guarantee it." Aurora stood still. "She was worried because she thought I was a threat," Damian continued. "The real threat was a woman behind the wheel of a car planning to move assets out of the country before the federal government could impose a lockdown." She looked at him. "My father is on the run." Trying. A moment. "Will you let him go?" That question, the way she asked it, wasn't a plea for mercy. Not a plea for protection, just a question, as if any answer would be the information she needed. "No," Damian said. Aurora nodded slowly. "Once." Then she turned and walked out the door. "Stop at the doorway, your back still turned to him." "I'm not asking you to spare him," she said softly. "I just want you to know that." Then she left. Wednesday night. Damian sat at the kitchen table at midnight with an unfinished glass of whiskey in front of him, the laptop screen casting a cold blue light on his face. Preston Hale's financial figures. Cayman accounts. Shell companies named after harmless-sounding resort destinations. He was working when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Light, barefoot. Stop at the top of the stairs and then continue. Aurora walked into the kitchen wearing an old flannel shirt and a pair of gray pajama shorts. Among the clothes Maria had packed before leaving, her eyes were slightly blurry, like someone who hadn't slept well and woken up in the middle of the night. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I didn't know he was still awake," she said. "I often stay up late." She went to the refrigerator, opened it, gazed inside for a moment, like someone evaluating an option without actually being hungry. Closed it. Took a glass of water from the tap instead. She leaned against the kitchen counter, her hands clasped around a glass of water, and watched him work without trying to hide what she was seeing. "What did you find?" she asked. "What about what?" "My father." Damian hesitated. "Why do you want to know?" "Because it's my life," she said, her voice neither strong nor weak, straight as a line. "My father. The things he did. The things he was about to face. It's my life, and I was never allowed to know about it." Damian looked at her for another second. Then he turned the laptop screen towards her. Aurora set her glass of water down and approached. She stood next to him, close enough to see the screen, close enough for him to hear her breathing, and read. She read through the numbers, the company names, the transfer dates. She read in the way someone with no financial training but intelligent enough to grasp the meaning of what she saw. Her face remained expressionless while she read. That, in itself, was the most remarkable thing in the room. "How much?" she asked finally. "Around 80 million is trying to move out. And the Federation? We're building the case file. It's not enough to make an arrest yet." "Not yet," she repeated, and that word hung in the air between them like an object with its own weight. She looked up at him. And at such close proximity, closer than at any time since that first night, Damian saw something in her eyes he had never seen before. Not fear, not anger. Something was slowly hardening inside, like metal being melted and beginning to cool into a new form. "Can you stop him?" she asked. "Before he leaves?" "Maybe." "Then do it that way." Damian did not move. "What do you want me to do with him?" he asked, and it was the first time he'd ever asked that. A real question, not a test, not a challenge, as if the answer really mattered to what came next. Aurora looked at him. She stared longer than usual. "I don't want him dead," she said finally, slowly, as if she had just discovered something about herself in the moment she uttered those words. "It would be easier, much easier for me. But I don't want it." "So what do you want?" And Aurora Hale, the daughter carrying on her back the burden of 22 years of her life, looked into the eyes of the man to whom her father had offered her as a bargaining chip, and spoke the only thing in her life she had never been allowed to say aloud. "I want him to feel helpless," she said. "I want him to wake up one morning and have nothing left. No money, no power, no people, nothing to hide behind." Her voice didn't tremble. "I want the world to see who he is." Damian gazed at her for a moment so long that they both felt its weight. Then he did something she wasn't entirely prepared for. He placed his hand on hers, not grasping, not holding, just placing it, so gently it was almost imperceptible, and said, "All right." And Aurora Virelli, for the first time since entering this house, did not withdraw her hand. That moment lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Damian's phone rang on the table. He looked down at the screen. Dominic. Emergency call. He looked up at Aurora. She took a half step back, clutching the glass of water once again, her face returning to its familiar, calculated calm. Damian answered the phone. "Go ahead and speak." "Preston Hale," Dominic said, his voice carrying something that made the muscles in Damian's shoulders tense instantly. "He's not at the hotel anymore. Check out at 10 o'clock tonight. We lost track of him at the Lincoln Tunnel." Damian stood up. "Plane? They're checking Teterboro and Westchester, but Damian..." Dominic paused briefly, the kind of pause someone makes when considering what to say next. "He's not alone. He has someone with him, and that person is carrying something we should be more concerned about than money." What? The file, Dominic said. The file on Virelli Syndicate. 10 years of trading, real name, real account number. Enough to bury us all if it falls into the right hands. The kitchen was completely silent. Damian wasn't looking at Aurora, but he sensed she was looking at him, looking with an expression she didn't try to hide. The look of someone who realized that in 10 seconds, everything had changed irreversibly. How long until he can board the plane? Damian asked into the phone. If he were to arrive at Teterboro now, 2 hours. Maybe less. Damian looked at his watch, 12:20. I'll go there, he said. He hung up the phone. Walk out of the kitchen without looking back. He stopped at the doorway, his back still turned toward Aurora. Don't leave the house tonight, he said. Not because I ordered you to. For a reason. She said nothing. He walked out. And Aurora Virelli stood alone in the cold kitchen with a glass of water in her hand, listening to the sound of car engines starting outside, listening to the iron gate opening and closing, and realizing something in the silence that followed, something she wasn't ready to name, not ready to look straight in the eye. The man had just left to confront her father, and she didn't know which side she was on. She didn't know which side she was on. That was her last thought before she set the glass of water down on the kitchen counter and decided that there would be no answer to that question tonight. And standing here in the darkness with the laptop screen still lit on the table wouldn't help her. She turned off the kitchen light, climbed the stairs. I lay down in bed, but couldn't fall asleep. The rain started at 12:45. It wasn't a drizzle, it was real rain, the kind of November rain carried by the Atlantic wind, lapping against the window panes in irregular bursts. Aurora lay in the darkness, listening to the rain and the waves from the cliffs below, trying not to think about the things her brain kept conjuring up. Her father's footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the Midtown apartment, fast or slow, heavy or light. Tonight Preston Hale is on the highway, in a car whose license plate she doesn't know, with a box containing something that could bury Damian Virelli and everyone around him. And here she lay, in that man's flannel shirt, listening to the rain. Her eyes didn't close until almost 3 in the morning. Teterboro Airport is located in northeastern New Jersey, about 20 minutes from Manhattan if the roads are clear and there's nothing to lose. Damian is 17 minutes away. He sat in the car looking out at the wet runway while Dominic stood by the car door talking on the phone. Rain pounded on the metal roof in an irregular rhythm. The headlights of 2 other SUVs behind them formed a V-shape, reflecting on the wet tarmac. The Gulfstream G550 is registered under the name of Shell Delaware, Dominic said as he opened the car door. The declared itinerary is Cancun, but the actual flight plan, he pulled out his phone. Zurich. Damian looked at the screen. He said nothing. The plane is still refueling. Departure is scheduled for 1:15. Dominic looked at his watch. We have about 30 minutes. The person who came with Preston. His name is Garrett Walsh. He's a lawyer. He specializes in cross-border asset transfers. He worked privately for Hale Capital for 6 years. Dominic paused. And he's the one who collected the files. How much exactly does Garrett Walsh know? That's enough to make him a separate problem for Preston. Damian opened the car door and stepped out. The rain hit his shoulders, soaking through the fabric in seconds. He didn't have a raincoat. He'd left home too quickly. He didn't care. I'm going in, he said. Damian, Dominic followed. We don't know where Walsh has the files. Maybe he's on him. Maybe he's already sent them. Then let's find out. If it has already been sent, we'll deal with that later. Damian's voice was as flat as the road in front of him. First, I need to see Preston Hale and talk to him. Dominic recognized that tone. He knew what lay beneath that surface of calm. He didn't argue further. They went through the side gate using a key card that an airport ground staff member who had received a thick envelope the previous month had left open. Preston Hale stood beside the Gulfstream in a thick navy blue coat, his hair wet, clutching a black leather briefcase he hadn't put down since leaving the hotel. Garrett Walsh stood 3 steps away, 40 years old, wearing metal-rimmed glasses, the kind of man who had spent most of his life in an office and didn't regret it. Preston recognized them immediately when the headlights of the Virelli convoy appeared from the airport gate. He turned to Walsh. Get on the plane, he said. Walsh didn't move. He watched the approaching cars. his face turning ashen in the manner of a probabilist who dislikes the outcome. "Now," Preston said, his voice rising a note. "Preston." "Now, Garrett." Walsh walked toward the plane's stairs. The crew at the door above, a young flight attendant and the captain, looked at the approaching cars with a bewildered expression. Damian stepped out of the car first, even before it had come to a complete stop. Preston Hale turned to face him in the pouring rain, his eyes red and his lips tightly pressed together, as if he had mentally prepared himself for this moment, but still hadn't. "Damian!" The punch came before Preston could finish his sentence. Not a punch of control. The punch of someone who has held on to something for too long and decides not to hold on anymore. Damian's fist slammed into Preston Hale's left jaw with the force of his whole body, and Preston fell vertically onto the wet tarmac, his briefcase flying out of his hand, his chin hitting the airport pavement. It's raining. Preston lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his hands reaching out as if searching for something to hold on to. Blood and rainwater mingled on his face. Damian stood above him, breathing heavier than usual, his fists still clenched. "The documents," he said. Preston spat blood onto the floor. "The briefcase," he said, his voice cracking from pain and rain. "In the briefcase, Walsh has a copy." "I know about Walsh." Damian bent down and picked up the briefcase. "Combination lock." He looked at Preston. "Open it." Preston looked up at him from the floor. A 58-year-old man lying on the wet tarmac of a private airport on a rainy night, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, hair plastered to his face. He looked like anything but the man who appeared on the cover of Forbes. 3972, Preston said. Dominic took the briefcase from Damian's hand. He entered the code. He opened it. Inside, a portable hard drive. 2 sealed envelopes, a set of printed documents in a plastic bag. Dominic took out the hard drive. He looked at Damian. Damian nodded. Dominic passed the hard drive to the man behind him, one of Syndicate's technicians who had been called in earlier and was standing in the shadows next to one of the SUVs with his laptop open. "Walsh," Damian said. 2 soldiers climbed the plane's stairs. 30 seconds later, they brought Garrett Walsh down. He walked voluntarily, his hands raised to shoulder level, his metal-rimmed glasses askew, his face pale but his steps unwavering. A good lawyer, uncompromising. Damian looked at Walsh. "Copy." Walsh looked at him through his crooked glasses. "The laptop is in my briefcase," he said, his voice unusually flat. "And a cloud copy. I can delete it now if you want." "Give me your laptop first." Walsh didn't argue. He nodded toward the bag that one of the soldiers was holding. The soldier handed it to Damian. Damian gave it to the technician. Garrett Walsh looked at him with the eyes of someone calculating every second. "He wanted the cloud version," Walsh said. "I deleted it. He has proof I deleted it. And then he let us go." Damian looked at him. "He is negotiating with me. I am offering a solution that is reasonable for both sides." "There are no 2 sides here, Walsh." Walsh was silent for a moment. "There's something you don't know," he said. And there was something in his voice, not threatening, closer to careful, which made Damian stop. "Go ahead and speak." Walsh glanced at Preston Hale, still sitting on the tarmac, one hand supporting his jaw. Then he looked back at Damian. "The 3rd copy," Walsh said. "Not my laptop, not my cloud." Damian didn't move. "Explain." "Preston sent a copy directly to the FBI 3 days before he left the hotel," Walsh said, each word clear and careful, like someone reading the terms of a crucial contract. "Not for cooperation, for assurance. A waiver of prosecution. If he arrives in Zurich safely and contacts us again, he will provide additional information. If he... or not. If you contact them again within 72 hours, the FBI will automatically open that file." It's raining. Damian stood still for 10 seconds. Then he turned to look at Preston Hale on the floor. Preston looked up at him, and this time there wasn't pure fear in his eyes. There was something else. Something that Damian took another 2 seconds to recognize. Calculate. Preston Hale, even sitting on the wet tarmac with blood on his face, was still calculating. "He planned this," Damian said softly. Preston did not deny it. "Since when?" Damian asked. "From the moment I realized he couldn't let me go whether I paid the debt or not." Preston said, his voice strained by jaw pain but still clear. Luca is his brother. He would never let that go. I knew that the moment he sat down opposite me in the cigar lounge. Dominic approached Damian. He spoke softly, close to his ear. If this is true, I know. Then we can't. I know. Damian's voice was sharper. Dominic stepped back. Damian looked down at Preston Hale in the rain and felt something he didn't often feel. A trap closing in. Not the trap of a stronger opponent. Not the trap of overwhelming power. The trap of someone who had nothing left to lose and was therefore willing to sacrifice what the other couldn't. Preston Hale was betting on that. That Damian Virelli couldn't do anything to him without activating the self-destruct mechanism. He wasn't wrong. 72 hours, Damian said. Counting from 3 days ago, Walsh said. You have about... He glanced at his watch. 48 hours left. They drove home in silence. Dominic was driving. Damian sat in the front seat, looking out at the wet road, rainwater streaking across the windshield like veins on a map with no destination. 2 SUVs followed behind. Preston and Walsh were sitting in the second car, not handcuffed, not tied up, simply with no better option than to go along. 48 hours. Damian looked at that number from every angle he could. If the FBI opens a case, that's 10 years of transactions. Real names, real accounts, a chain of evidence sufficient to build an indictment against at least 20 people in the syndicate, including him. Including Dominic. Including those with families and children, people whom Damian has vouched for over the years. Nothing in his crisis management notebook was written for this situation. Choose, he said into the air. Dominic didn't ask again. He knew Damian was talking to himself. 1, find the FBI agent handling the file and stop it before it opens. 2, find the technical details of the waiver agreement Preston signed and determine if it's legally valid. 3, he paused. What is a father? Dominic asked. My father told Preston to call the FBI and tell them he was wrong. He wouldn't do that. He will do it if I give him what he wants. Dominic glanced over. And what does he want? Damian didn't reply immediately. Outside the window, the New Jersey streetlights drifted by like faint streaks of light in the rain. The George Washington Bridge loomed ahead, its suspension cables hanging in the darkness like a giant spiderweb. He wants Aurora, Damian said. They brought Preston and Walsh back to the safe house in Hoboken at 2:15 a.m. A 3-story townhouse that the syndicate kept for cases needing something between the hotel and the prison. Damian left Walsh in the second-floor bedroom with a guard. Preston was in the first-floor living room. His jaw had been examined. Not broken, just badly bruised, and he had been given an ice pack and a glass of water. Damian sat opposite Preston at a low wooden table. The only light in the room was the table lamp, its soft yellow light enough to see each other, but not enough to feel comfortable. Is she all right? Preston asked first. His swollen lips made his voice sound a little distorted. He asked as if he cared. I'm interested. No, Damian said. Those who care wouldn't do what he did. Preston looked down at his hands, large hands, resting on his thighs, his knuckles rough in the way of a man who had done manual labor before money replaced work. That moment of silence held something more complex than Damian wanted to admit. I know nothing I say can explain enough, Preston said. Not in an apologetic tone, the tone of someone who had practiced saying it enough times that it came out naturally without carrying any real meaning. That's right, so don't try it. I want to see her. I already said no. Just once. So I know she's okay. Let him know. Damian's voice lowered, not in a threatening tone, but in the raw truth within. You've known her for 22 years, Preston. You lived in the same house as her. You've taken her to the hospital more than once. And you stood at the wedding weeping like a father who's lost his child. Preston didn't answer. Don't come to me in the language of a loving father, Damian said. I've read the medical records. The silence in the room was so long that the sound of the rain outside became even more audible. Preston finally looked up. I need you to listen to me, he said. Or not. Not to make excuses, to help you understand. I don't need to understand. Damian stood up. I need you to call the FBI agent handling your case and tell them he's backing out of the deal. Preston looked at him. And in return? He wasn't buried at the bottom of the sea before dawn. That's the worst offer I've ever received. He is not in a negotiating position. Everyone has a negotiating position when they have something the other person needs, Preston said. And in his voice resurfaced something Damian had seen on the tarmac. That calculation that never truly faded, even when his face was swollen and the future was shrinking by the hour. You need me to call the FBI. That means I still have value. Damian looked at him, and what he realized in that moment, realized with uncomfortable clarity, was that Preston Hale was right. Not in a moral sense, not in any way that would make him worthy of respect, but in a purely pragmatic sense, this man still held a card that Damian needed. What do you want? Damian asked. His voice was flat. No compromise. Just a question. Preston hesitated. 1 second, 2. I want to leave, he said. Out of this country. Zurich or anywhere. I want you not to follow me. I want... And Aurora. Preston stopped. He wants Aurora to come along, Damian said. That's what he really meant. It lasted for a moment. She's my daughter, Preston said. Not anymore, Damian said. And the way he said it, not to win the argument, not to hurt, but because it had somehow become true in his head, made Preston Hale look at him with something that looked like astonishment. Damian turned away. Go to sleep. We'll talk more tomorrow morning. He went outside and stood in the rain in front of the Hoboken house at 3 a.m, phone in hand, staring at the number 48 in his head and feeling what he internally called physical limits of the situation. A point where all roads lead to some degree of loss, and the only question is what to lose the least. Dominic stood 3 steps away from him, his collar turned up, his eyes fixed on the road. I need to know if the FBI agreement is real, Damian said. It's being verified. Our lawyers are working on it tonight. And if that's true? Dominic did not respond immediately. Then the door narrowed considerably, he said, in the end. Damian nodded once. Call me when you have the results. He drove back to Long Island alone. At 4:25 in the morning, Damian entered the Long Island mansion and heard sounds coming from downstairs. Not a human voice, the sound of water, the kitchen faucet. He went downstairs. Aurora stood in the kitchen wearing a flannel shirt and gray pajama pants, washing a dish under cold water in a way that was utterly pointless at this time of morning, the kind of washing someone needs to do by hand while their mind is constantly working. She heard his footsteps, turn off the tap, turn around, look at his face. That's not right, she said. It wasn't a question. Damian didn't answer immediately. He went to the kitchen, poured some cold water from the refrigerator, drank half of it, and set the glass down. Your father has submitted the file to the FBI, he said. He saw no reason not to be blunt. The agreement automatically activates if he doesn't contact us again within 48 hours. Aurora stood still. He couldn't stop it. I don't know. He looked at the glass of water. I don't know yet. She slowly placed the cup down on the kitchen counter. What do you need me to do? She asked. That question, the way she asked it, was not about sacrifice, not about being a victim once again. It was a pragmatic question of someone assessing available resources and wanting to know what they could contribute. Damian looked at her. Nothing, he said. Don't do that. What does that mean? Don't assume I'm not involved, she said, her voice low but with clear weight. My father created this situation. I am involved. Damian looked at her for another second. Then he sat down in the kitchen chair, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since leaving home at midnight, he allowed himself to actually sit down. He wants to see her, Damian said. Aurora didn't react immediately. And he wants me to go meet him. Or not. But he's considering it. Damian did not deny it. Not to compromise, he said. He stopped. He didn't have clean words for what he was thinking. If you're willing to face him, it could change the negotiating position, not because he feels sorry for you, but because he needs your agreement to go with him for his plan to make sense. If you don't agree, that plan loses what he thinks he holds. Aurora gazed at him for a long moment. He just told me that he's using me as leverage, she said. Have. And he wanted to use me to break that leverage. I asked if she wanted it, Damian said. That's something different. She gazed at him for a moment, in complete silence except for the wind outside the window and the distant sound of waves below the cliff. If I looked at his face, she said slowly, as if she were realizing for the first time something that had been lurking beneath the surface for a long time, I don't know what I would do. Be more specific. I don't know if I'll still be afraid, she said, sitting down in the chair opposite him, her hands on the table, looking into the space between them. For my whole life, seeing him meant fear, automatically, without thinking. Now I'm no longer in his apartment. I don't know what it would be like if I looked at his face now, in this situation. Damian sat still. And that scared her, he said. That leaves me unsure. Not knowing for sure doesn't mean you should be afraid. She looked up at him. Where did he learn that? I've been unsure about many things in my life, Damian said. People just keep living. Another silence. This time shorter, slightly warmer in a way that both noticed and neither commented on. I'll go with you, Aurora said finally. Are you sure? No. She stood up. But I will go. Damian's phone rang at 5:15 in the morning. He was sitting in his office, his eyes red from lack of sleep and the glare of the screen when he saw Dominic's name. Go ahead and speak. The deal is real, Dominic said, and those 3 words slammed against him like a steel door. Our lawyer confirms it. Preston Hale signed a cooperation agreement with the federal office for the Southern District 12 days before the wedding. The agent in charge is Marcus Webb from the Organized Financial Crimes Unit. Webb. Damian. Dominic's voice dropped a tone. I know that name. Me too. And that's what made the room suddenly feel smaller, because Marcus Webb wasn't just any name. Marcus Webb was the one who had launched the investigation into the Virelli syndicate 2 years earlier, only to have it shut down midway due to lack of evidence. Marcus Webb was someone Damian had heard of enough times to know that this was a man who never gave up. And Marcus Webb is now sitting on Preston Hale's file, waiting for the countdown to begin. How many hours are left? Damian asked. From the moment Preston checked out of the hotel at 10 o'clock last night, there are approximately 41 hours left. 41 hours. Find out everything about Webb, Damian said. His house, his car, his schedule, his weaknesses. Dominic was silent for a brief moment. Damian, if we mess with a federal agent, I didn't say touch him. I said find out, Damian said flatly. We need to know what we're dealing with before we decide what to do next. Okay. And Dominic, he paused. Contact Raymond Cho. This time Dominic actually stopped. Raymond Cho, a criminal lawyer with a network of contacts stretching from New York federal courts to Washington offices that the average person wouldn't have in their directory. The man Virelli syndicate paid handsomely, only to never need his services. Are you sure? Dominic asked. Call him. 7 o'clock in the morning. The first gray rays of the new day pierced through the thick clouds and touched the windows of the second-floor office in the Long Island mansion. Damian sat with his 4th cup of coffee and looked out at the garden. A garden wet from the night's rain, the grass heavy with dew, the last black roses of the season drooping under the weight of the water. Walking down the hallway. Then there was a knock on the door, gentle, without hesitation. Enter. Aurora walked in dressed, black jeans, a thick gray sweater, her hair neatly tied up. Her face no longer had that hazy look of someone who had just woken up. Her eyes were clearer and sharper in a way that Damian noticed immediately. When are we leaving? She asked. She has made her decision. I made the decision at 3 in the morning. I just needed a few more hours of sleep to clear my head. Damian looked at her. 10 o'clock in the morning, he said. I need to arrange a few things first. She nodded, turned away. Aurora. She paused, turned slightly, just enough to see him over her shoulder. If, after looking at his face, you want to leave, Damian said, just tell me. The conversation will end immediately. She looked at him. A long, scrutinizing gaze, not distrustful, but not entirely trusting either. Something in between, something learning gradually. Okay, she said. She left. Damian turned to look out the window. 41 hours. Check. At 8:15, Damian's phone displayed a notification from the technician who was checking the equipment seized the previous night. He read it again. Stand up, step out into the hallway, call out the name of the soldier on night duty. Call Dominic right now. The soldier looked at his face and didn't ask for the reason. He immediately picked up the phone and made the call. Because what the technicians found on Preston Hale's hard drive wasn't just Virelli syndicate files. That's something else. Something Damian hadn't anticipated. Something that caused the entire picture he'd been building in his head for the past 3 days to suddenly go completely wrong in one crucial aspect. There is a second folder on the hard drive. It cannot be named after the company name, nor can it be coded according to Hale Capital's system. It must be named simply and ruthlessly with a single word. Aurora. And inside that folder are things that, if they were made public, not to the FBI, not to the courts, but to the world, would not destroy Damian Virelli. They will destroy her. Folder name Aurora. There are 107 files. Damian stood in his office, staring at the laptop screen the technician had placed on his desk, and read the file list as if searching for something other than what was currently displayed. He found nothing. The list remained unchanged no matter how long he looked. Photos, videos, scanned documents, audio recordings. The days and months stretched across 14 years, beginning when Aurora was 8 years old. The technician, a 29-year-old man named Theo, whom Damian had employed for 3 years because he was competent and didn't ask unnecessary questions, stood in the corner of the room staring at the wall. That was Theo's way of handling situations where he didn't want to testify but had no choice. "How many have you opened?" Damian asked. Enough to understand the content. Theo's voice was flat, a professional tone that had to be flat. No opening it further. "What is the content?" "Stop." "A surveillance file," Theo said. "From childhood to adulthood. Photos from angles she didn't know she was being photographed. Audio recordings, her voice, the doctor's voice, the voices of the people she spoke to. Some medical documents that were photographed." He paused. "And some other things I won't describe in words." Damian placed his hands on the table. Placed them gently. Flattened both palms on the wood. Looked down at them. "What is Preston keeping these things for?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Control," Theo said simply. "If she ever tries to get away from him, tries to report, tries to talk to anyone, he has plenty of things to completely smear." He looked down at the floor. "That's why she never left, I guess." Damian did not reply. He looked at the file list for another 10 seconds. Then he closed the laptop, not forcefully, with the control of someone who devotes all their energy to not breaking anything in the room. "No one is allowed to open any more files in that folder," he said. "Not her, not Dominic, not you. Do you understand?" "Understand." "Go." "Follow me out." Damian stood alone in the room with his laptop closed on the desk, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. Preston Hale didn't just torture his daughter. He kept it. Systematize it. Keep it as a weapon. See, Dominic arrived at Hoboken at 15 minutes to 9. Damian was there first, driving alone as dawn broke across the George Washington Bridge as the first rays of light filtered through thick clouds and turned the Hudson River below a leaden gray. He didn't play music. He didn't make calls. He just drove. When Dominic entered the townhouse in Hoboken, Damian was standing in the first-floor hallway with his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the closed door where Preston Hale was either sleeping or pretending to sleep inside. "I heard Theo's report," Dominic said as he approached. And I want to go in there and put an end to this right now." "Impossible." "Damian, no." Damian's voice didn't rise. It wasn't necessary. "If we did that, those 41 hours would become irrelevant because the FBI would have plenty of other reasons to come here. And," he paused, "and Aurora deserves to see him lose everything. Not disappear, lose, one by one, right before her eyes." Dominic looked at him. "Does she know about the folder yet?" "Or not?" "Will he tell her?" Damian didn't reply immediately. "Not yet," he said finally. "After this is over." "And what if she finds out before it's finished?" There's no good answer to that question. Damian isn't trying to find one. "Is Preston awake yet?" he asked. Wake up at 6 o'clock, the guard at the end of the corridor said. Ask for coffee. I won't give it to you. Damian nodded. He walked to the door. He knocked twice. Open it. Preston Hale sat on the edge of the bed, back straight, hands resting on his thighs. His left jaw was deeply bruised in a band running from his cheekbone down to his chin, swollen enough to reveal a slight misalignment. His eyes were red from lack of sleep or crying, or both, but his gaze didn't drop when Damian entered. He looked straight ahead. That was the only thing Damian couldn't decide whether he should respect or hate. Damian stood in the middle of the room. He didn't sit down. He didn't lean against the wall. He stood straight with his hands in his pockets and looked at the man in front of him. The Aurora folder, Damian said. Nothing on Preston's face changed. And that's exactly what let Damian know he knew exactly what he was talking about. How long has he had it? Damian asked. Preston didn't answer. How long? 14 years, Preston said finally. His voice was neither apologetic nor remorseful. It sat somewhere in between in a way Damian had no words to describe. When did you plan to use it? When needed? When she tried to escape from him? When she tries to do something foolish? Preston looked at him. She doesn't understand the world we live in. Stop. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut Preston's sentence off like a knife. Damian stood still for another 3 seconds, long enough to control what he wanted to do with his hands. I'll set one condition for you, Damian said. 1. You call Agent Webb before noon today and withdraw the cooperation agreement. You tell him that you signed under pressure and that the records are unreliable. You request cancellation. Preston looked at him. In return? In return, the Aurora folder was completely deleted. No one saw it. No one knew it existed. The room was silent. Through the small window near the ceiling, the morning light filtered in the gloomy way of a winter day. And me? Preston asked. After I call. He will be handed over to those I choose. It means death. That means losing your freedom. Damian stared straight at him. If I wanted you dead, Preston, you would have died on the tarmac last night. Preston looked down at his hands, and Damian saw it. The moment when the man before him was truly calculating, not looking for an escape route, but weighing the weight of what remained after all options had proven bad. I want to see Aurora before I call, Preston said. Or not. I want... No. Damian took a step closer, enough to make Preston look up. She's not a condition for negotiation. She's not a gift. She's not property you have the right to claim. You've already taken enough. Preston stood up. He rose slowly, with the obvious pain in his jaw, but stood up and looked directly at Damian in the way of someone who had decided that lying down would be worse. She's my daughter, he said, and this time there was something breaking in his voice. Not quite genuine emotion, but something older and more painful than calculation. Whatever you think of me, whatever I've done, she's the woman he spent 22 years trying to break, Damian said, and she's still standing. That has nothing to do with him. Preston looked at him. His eyes turned even redder, his jaw clenched, and then relaxed. When do I have to decide, Guy? He asked. 11 o'clock. I'll be back. Damian stepped out of the room and closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a second. A single second, unseen by anyone, before pushing himself out the door and down the hallway. He called Aurora at 9:30. I need more time, he said. Tonight instead of this morning. There was a brief pause from the other end of the line. Are you okay? She asked. It's being processed. Is there anything you need me to do? That sentence. Is there anything you need me to do? We struck him in a way he was unprepared for. Not because it was weakness, quite the opposite. No, he said. Stay home. I'll be back before evening. He hung up the phone. Dominic stood 2 steps away, looking at him with the gaze of someone who had worked with him long enough to read the words between them. He's protecting her from him, Dominic said. I'm handling the situation. Damian. What? He's protecting her. Damian did not reply. Dominic said nothing more. 11 o'clock arrived and Damian entered Preston's room for the second time. Preston was standing at the small window, not much visible, just a patch of sky and the top of the building opposite, with a glass of water in his hand. The guard had given him coffee, looked at Damian's face, and realized he shouldn't report it. "It's decided," Damian said. Preston didn't come back right away. "If I call Webb and retract my statement," he said to the window, "he'll know I'm being coerced. He will be suspicious. Suspicion is not proof. He will investigate. Let him investigate." Damian entered the room. "Investigation takes time. Time is something I have and you don't." Preston turned around. In the morning light of the small room, without candlelight, without the sophistication of a cigar lounge or the veil of money, Preston Hale looked just as he truly was. A man aging faster than his age, carrying burdens too heavy for too long, and not healthy enough to continue. "I don't want her to hate me," Preston said. The words came out of his mouth in a way that had been kept secret for a long time, not calculated, not tactical. It was so genuine that it made both men in the room pause at it. Damian looked at him. "He did everything to make sure it happened," he said. "No judgment. Fact. I know." Preston set the glass of water down on the table. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion, a tremor of muscles that no longer trust themselves. "I can't explain what I did in any way that would mean anything to you, to anyone. I know that." "Then don't try it. But I want you to know one thing." Preston looked directly at Damian. "She's smarter than anyone I've ever met, since she was a child. Smart in a way that makes people afraid if they're not strong enough to stand beside her." He paused. "I'm not strong enough." The room was silent. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It wasn't the silence of understanding. It was the silence of two men standing on opposite sides of something that couldn't be bridged by words. "The phone," Damian said last. Preston looked at him for another second. Then he nodded. "Mars." The call to Marcus Webb took place at 11:17, with Damian standing 2 steps away from Preston and Dominic at the doorway. Preston called from his own phone, the phone that had been returned after the battery was removed the night before, and then turned back on for this purpose. "Marcus," Preston's voice was surprisingly steady. "I need to talk to you about the deal." The voice on the other end of the line, not clearly audible from Damian's distance, only the tone of voice. Caution. Suspicion. "I signed under pressure," Preston said. "I wasn't in a stable mental state. The documents I provided had authenticity issues, some things I couldn't verify the source of." The voice came from the other end of the line again. This time it was louder. "Marcus," Preston's voice stiffened slightly. "I'm withdrawing. It's my right under Clause 4 of the agreement, and you know that." The voice from the other end of the line lasted longer this time. Preston listened. His expression remained unchanged. "That's my decision," he said after the call ended. "I'll get back to you through official legal channels." He hung up, silent. "He doesn't believe it," Preston said without turning around. "I know." "He will investigate." "I know." "Well then, this—" Preston pointed to the phone. "It's just buying you more time." "There's enough time to do what needs to be done," Damian said. "That's all I need. Bam." Damian left Hoboken at 10 minutes to 12. He drove east, across the bridge, and as Manhattan appeared before him with its familiar skyline cutting into the gray sky, he called Raymond Cho. The lawyer answered the phone after a few rings. "I'm listening," Cho said. "Marcus Webb, Southern District. I need to know his weakness." The sound of keyboard typing came from the other end of the line. "Webb has no financial weaknesses," Cho said after 30 seconds. "Clean in that sense, but," he continued typing, "he's dealing with an internal complaint from September, an investigation that was prematurely terminated, which he believes was due to interference from above. He's unhappy. He wants to prove something. That means he won't easily give up on the Preston case. That means he will vary. It's not easy to give up." Stop typing. "Damian, if Preston has actually handed over the documents, then withdrawing the verbal agreement isn't enough. The documents are still in the federal system." "I know." "He needs something in exchange." Cho's voice slowed, becoming cautious. "Something Webb wants more than he wants you." Damian drove through an intersection and looked toward Midtown in the distance. "I have that," he said. "Stop at the word give. Short." "What?" Preston Hale is collaborating with 5 foreign investors in a securities fraud scheme that the SEC never had enough evidence to prosecute. I have the names. I have the transactions. I have everything to build a case much bigger than Virelli's. Damian looked straight ahead. Webb wants that more than he wants me. Cho exhaled slowly. He wanted me to approach Webb. Not officially. Find an intermediary. Tell him there's something bigger waiting if he's willing to listen. And what if he doesn't listen? Damian did not answer that question. Call me when you have your first contact. He hung up the phone. Watch. He arrived back in Long Island at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The house was quiet, like a winter afternoon, not windy enough, not waves big enough, just cold air and a dull white light streaming through the windows. Carlo was patrolling the garden. The soldier downstairs nodded as Damian entered. Mrs. Virelli? Damian asked. Her room, all morning. Damian went upstairs. He stopped in front of Aurora's room door. He knocked. Enter. She sat at the table by the window, exactly where he'd first seen her when he entered the room. But this time she wasn't holding a book. She was drawing. A blank sheet of paper from someone's notebook left in the room, a pencil from the desk drawer, and her hand moving across the paper with the kind of concentration one only has when trying not to think about something else. She looked up as he walked in. Look at his face. Tell me, she said. Damian pulled a small chair from the corner of the room, placed it 2 steps away from her desk, and sat down. He didn't lean back. He sat upright, elbows on his knees, looking at her. He told her about the call with Webb, about Raymond Cho, about the plan to exchange information. He didn't mention the folder. It wasn't because he decided never to say it, but because right now, with everything in motion, adding that wouldn't help her and might break something inside her at the wrong time. That's what he said to himself. He wasn't entirely sure he believed it. Aurora listened in complete silence, without interrupting, without asking for confirmation, without doing anything one might typically do when processing uncomfortable information. She simply listened, her pencil resting on the paper and her hand still. When he finished speaking, she looked down at the paper. He won't let you go easily, she said. Webb, nobody in this situation is going to let anyone get away easily. How much time do you have? If Cho can reach Webb before tonight, 24 hours to negotiate, maybe less. She nodded slowly. Then she looked up at him with the gaze of someone who had sat alone all morning, heading somewhere in their head without needing any guidance. I want to go see him, she said. Damian didn't reply immediately. Aurora, it's not because he needs me to go, she said. Because I need to go. I need to see his face at least once, when I don't have to fear what might happen afterward. Damian looked at her. She looked back, straight, unwavering, with something in her eyes that he had seen taking shape day by day in this house, and now was strong enough to stand firm. Tonight, he said finally. Okay. They arrived in Hoboken at 6 o'clock in the evening. It was already dark when the car stopped in front of the townhouse. The wind rising from the Hudson River carried the chill of November, the kind of cold that cuts through fabric regardless of the thickness of a coat. Aurora got out of the car and looked up at the building. He said nothing. Damian stood beside her, not touching her, not trying to say anything to fill the void. Ready? He asked. She inhaled, deeply, exhaled slowly. Let's go. They walked in. The guard led them to the second floor, not Preston's room, but a larger room at the end of the hallway, where Dominic had arranged tables and chairs and the lighting was bright enough. Neutral. No advantage for either side. When the door opened and Preston Hale saw his daughter walk in, the first thing that happened was he stood up, immediately, reflexively, in the manner of someone who hadn't had time to think. Aurora stopped in the middle of the room. They looked at each other. Damian stood against the right wall, close enough to intervene, but far enough away not to be a part of the moment. Preston Hale looked 10 years older than the man Damian had met at the cigar lounge a week earlier. Not because of the bruise on his face, because something in the way he stood had changed. As if the internal structure that kept him upright had lost a few rivets. Aurora, he said. His voice cracked in the middle of her name. She didn't answer immediately, and Damian, standing by the wall, watching, saw what was happening on her face. He saw it layer by layer, the automatic fear she had spoken of, the old reflex kicking in like a programmed machine. He saw it coming. He saw her realize it was coming, and seeing her, he didn't let it stop. "I didn't come here to forgive you," Aurora said. Her voice was low and flat and didn't tremble. "I didn't come here to hear your explanations. I came so you could see me standing here without your permission." Preston stood still. "All my life," she continued, "I haven't been allowed to exist in my own way in any space you're in. I've learned to shrink. I've learned to be silent. I've learned to stand in the corner and take up as little air as possible." She looked straight at him. "But I'm still here, and you no longer have any power over that." Preston closed his eyes. 1 second, 2. When he opened his eyes, they were redder than before. "I know an apology isn't enough," he said. "Not enough," Aurora agreed. Not sarcastically, it was factual. "But Have you called the FBI yet?" she interrupted. Preston looked at Damian. Damian didn't move. "I've already called," Preston said. "Fine." She stood there for another moment, looking at her father's face as if she were storing something away. Not to remember it fondly, but to close the door. "Then I have nothing more to say to you." She turned around. "Step out the door." Damian followed, a step behind her, and as he crossed the threshold, he heard from behind the sound of Preston Hale sitting down in a chair with the heavy gait of someone whose knees were no longer reliable, and a long sigh that was neither relief nor despair, but something else, something nameless. The hallway was silent. Aurora walked straight to the end, stopping at the staircase, one hand on the railing. She didn't turn back. Damian stood 3 steps away from her. He watched her shoulders move. Inhale, exhale, once, twice, regaining control of her breathing in the way someone who had practiced it countless times. Then her shoulders relaxed slightly, the release of someone letting go of something heavy. She didn't cry. Damian didn't know whether that made him sad or proud, or both. "It's over," she said softly. Not to him, to herself. "It's done," he confirmed. She nodded once. Then she walked down the stairs, her steps steady and straight, and Damian followed behind while his phone vibrated in his pocket. This time it was Raymond Cho, and as Damian glanced at the screen the moment they stepped out of the building into the cold night, he saw 3 words in the message. "Webb will meet." Damian stopped on the sidewalk. Aurora stopped beside him, looking into his face in a way she had learned to do, reading instead of asking. "Good or bad?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said truthfully, "but it's something." He started calling Cho again, and that's when the gunshots rang out. Not 1 sound, 3, quick and close, from the back door of the building, and in the fraction of a second before Damian's brain could process it, instinct, programmed into him by 15 years of experience, made him turn, his left hand outstretched, pushing Aurora down and toward the car in one motion, his body largely shielding her, his back exposed to the source of the sound. Aurora touched the side of the car. Damian stood up straight, his right hand searching for a weapon in the holster under his jacket, his eyes scanning towards the back door of the building. Carlo, the bodyguard who was with them, had drawn his gun and was moving toward the corner of the building. The radio blared. Dominic's voice. "2 of you get out. Back door. Not ours. Origin unknown." "How is Preston?" Damian said into the radio. "He stayed longer than he wanted." "Damian!" Dominic's voice changed in a way that Damian, experienced enough, recognized immediately, the tone of someone looking at something they didn't want to see. "Preston isn't in the room. The second-floor window is open." Damian looked up. The second-floor window of the Hoboken building, the room where they had sat 20 minutes earlier, was wide open on the cold night. "Garrett Walsh?" he asked. "He's here. He's locked in that room." Damian stood still for 3 seconds. Someone took Preston out. Preston didn't escape on his own, 20 meters from the second-floor window to the ground, in the dark, with a bruised jaw, no equipment, not by himself. Someone was outside. Someone who knew Preston was here. Someone who had enough men to take down the 2 bodyguards at the back door and drag Preston out in the time it took Damian and Aurora to stand in the hallway. 3 gunshots, fast and clean, professional. Aurora leaned against the back of the car behind him. He could hear her breathing, rapid but controlled. Not panicked, the kind of breathing of someone running on adrenaline and still processing reality. Who? She asked. Damian gazed into the shadows of Hoboken Street, toward the spot where Preston Hale had just vanished, and realized that the answer to that question would change everything he had planned. Because there's only one type of person who would have a reason to take Preston out of Virelli's syndicate tonight. Someone who doesn't want Preston talking to the FBI, doesn't want Preston continuing negotiations, and doesn't want anything in Preston's file to become public. Preston owed money to someone before he owed money to Virelli. And Damian suddenly remembered the 5 foreign investors in the fraud ring he had mentioned to Cho just 2 hours earlier. He just revealed that he has that information. Cho has accessed Webb, and that news reached the wrong person. "Get in the car," Damian said to Aurora. "Damian, get in the car." She came in. He called Dominic. "Lock Walsh up. No one is allowed near him until I get back." He walked toward his car, his eyes still scanning the street. "And find Raymond Cho for me. Right now." "Why are you looking for it?" Damian got into the driver's seat, closed the door, and looked straight ahead. "Ask him who he's been talking to besides Webb," Damian said, his voice cold in the way that only comes when everything is falling apart at once, and the only one who can hold it back is the one who is. Damian's voice trailed off mid-sentence as a second phone rang in his inner jacket pocket. Not Dominic, an unfamiliar number, but he recognized the area code. New Jersey. He looked at the screen for 2 seconds. "Answer the phone." "Virelli." A low, middle-aged voice came from the other end of the line, the kind that speaks infrequently and doesn't see a reason to start a conversation right now. "I'm Webb." Damian sat still in the car. Aurora was in the back seat, her breathing still not quite normal, her eyes fixed on the back of his neck in a way he could sense without turning around. "I'm listening," Damian said. "Cho called me 15 minutes ago," Webb said. "He told me he had information about a foreign investment network connected to Hale Capital." He paused. 20 minutes later, 3 of my employees reported being followed at 2 different locations, not yours." Damian said nothing. "Do you know what that means?" Webb asked. "I know." "Good." A sigh escaped from the other end of the line, not a sigh of relief, the kind someone recalculating the speed. "So you understand that the situation has changed in the last 20 minutes. Understand? Tell them he has a name and a transaction." "I have." "How many people?" "The main year, 17 people involved." The silence lasted longer. "Preston Hale has just been taken out of his hands," Webb said. Not a question. "Correct. The person who got him out was someone he owed money to before he owed you." Webb's voice was flat, the kind of voice of someone who'd been in the business long enough to be unsurprised but still not quite used to the harsh reality. "Those people don't want Preston talking to anyone, not even me. Including you." "That gives us the same problem temporarily," Webb said. "I don't like it, but I'm pragmatic." Damian looked out the car window at the dark streets of Hoboken. "He wants to see me," Damian said. "I want to exchange information in a way that allows both sides to continue to exist afterward." Webb's voice hardened slightly. "That's not forgiveness, Virelli. That's pragmatism. And after this is over, I'll still be building a file on you." "I know." "You don't mind, do you?" "You do your job. I do mine." Damian started the car. "Location and time." White. They met at 10 o'clock at night in a disused warehouse south of Bayonne, neutral in the sense that neither side had a clear geographical advantage, far enough from the main road so there would be no chance witnesses. Marcus Webb arrived with 2 men, not official FBI agents. He came alone in that sense. The other 2 were personal bodyguards in the informal sense of the word. The 51-year-old man with short, salt and pepper hair, a dark blue jacket without insignia, and brown eyes that looked at everything the way of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by anything anymore. Damian came to Dominic and Carlo. Aurora wasn't there. She was in a car parked 3 blocks away, with Dominic's most trusted soldier in the passenger seat and the engine running. The 2 groups stood at opposite ends of the empty warehouse. The only light came from someone's phone placed on a wooden crate in the middle of the room, casting a pale yellow circular shadow on the concrete ceiling. Webb stepped forward first. Damian replied. They stopped about 2 meters apart, close enough to talk without raising their voices, far enough so that neither felt any physical pressure. "Tell me what you have," Webb said bluntly. Damian wasn't in a hurry. First, I need to know where Preston is, he said. I do not know. He needs to know this to do his job. That's right, Webb looked at him. And you need to know for another reason. Damian neither confirmed nor denied it. The people who took Preston, Webb said, his voice lowering in a way that wasn't secretive but serious fact. I know who they are. Not local mafia, not ordinary business rivals. This is a transnational financial network that has been operating under federal radar for 12 years because they're smart enough to never leave a direct trail. He paused. Preston is the only direct trail I could get my hands on, and now they have him. They won't kill him, Damian said. No. They need him to be silent, not dead. Dead people generate investigation. Silent people don't. Webb looked directly at Damian. But they will kill anyone who threatens that network. You just became a threat to that network when Cho approached me. Damian stands by that. He's warning me, he said. I'm speaking factual, Webb said, his expression unchanged. I need the information you have. You need Preston not to be used as a weapon against you and your wife in the future. We can resolve both if you're willing to work in an imperfect way. What does imperfect mean? That means he provided information. I used it to build a larger case. In the process, Preston Hale's record on Virelli's syndicate became secondary, and its reliability could be debated. Webb paused. Not immunity. Not protection. Just a shift in investigative priorities. And Preston. If we find him, and that's my job, not yours, he'll be dealt with according to due process. Webb looked at him. Not yours. Damian was silent for a full 10 seconds. He thought about the folder. 107 files, 14 years. There's one more condition, Damian said. Speak. There's a folder on the hard drive we seized from Preston. It's not related to Virelli's syndicate. It's related to his daughter. Damian's voice didn't change tone. That folder didn't become evidence in any case. It didn't become public records. It wasn't mentioned. Webb looked at him. 1 second is long. He's seen the contents of it, Webb said. Not a question. Enough to understand. Webb nodded slowly. Not in immediate agreement, but as a gesture of someone who is handling the situation and believes they can handle it. If that folder relates to crimes against minors, it's relevant, Damian stated bluntly. And I want it treated as a separate case, not as an appendix to the financial case. Separate means the victim doesn't become public documentation. Webb looked at him for a moment with weight in his eyes. I can do that, he said finally, if the information you provide is strong enough. Strong enough, Damian said. And that was the agreement. No handshake, no signing, no form that the court could recognize. Just two men standing in a dark warehouse in Bayonne at 10 o'clock on a November night, looking at each other and deciding that this was the most viable option in a situation with no other good choice. Oh, they drove to Long Island in silence for most of the journey. Aurora sat in the back seat, looking out the window at the passing streetlights. Damian was driving. Dominic wasn't on the trip back. He'd stayed behind to deal with Walsh and sort things out in Hoboken. 15 minutes after leaving Bayonne, Aurora said, Is there something you haven't told me? Not a question. Damian looked in the rearview mirror. Her eyes in the mirror met his. Awake, rigid, knowing. He drove for another half-minute. Then he pulled over to the side of the road. Not a rest stop, not a parking lot, just the side of a quiet inner-city road lined with trees and with no other cars around. He turned off the headlights. He kept the engine running. He turned to look at her. There's a separate folder on your father's hard drive, he said. She looked at him. She said nothing. I didn't open it. My technician opened it enough to understand the contents. He paused. He kept records of you. Photos, recordings, documents, since you were 8 years old. Aurora didn't move. Outside the car, a gentle breeze rustled through the dry branches, its sound like something breathing in the distance. To control her, she said finally. Correct. If I try to escape, try to report it. Correct. She looked out the window, gazed at the shadows between the trees. How many people have seen it? She asked, her voice low and flat in a way that was more dangerous than if it were to break. My technician. Part of it. And I know it exists. Damian looked straight at her. Nobody else. Webb? I told him it existed and that it needed to be handled separately. I didn't say what the contents were. He paused. He agreed. She remained silent for so long that Damian began to think about saying something more, then decided against it, realizing this was the kind of silence that needed space, not words. Where's that folder now? She asked. The physical hard drive is in a safe in Long Island. The digital copy has been erased from the technician's system. What will he do with it? What he wants to do is destroy it completely, Damian said. But that's your decision, not mine. She turned to look at him. In the dim light from the car's dashboard, her face looked different, not weaker, not broken, just more real, in the sense that the protective layers had receded, leaving what lay beneath visible. Destroy it, she said. Damian nodded. As soon as I get home, Itkel. They burned the hard drive at midnight. No ceremonial actions, no words, no solemn moments. Just Damian, Aurora, and the outdoor fireplace at the end of the garden that was often used in the fall when the sea breeze was cool enough to call for a fire, but not yet cold enough to stay indoors. Damian put the hard drive into the fire. Aurora stood beside him and watched it burn, watching with the complete attention of someone observing every second of an irreversible event, and finding peace in that very irreversibility. The fire took 12 minutes to do its job. When all that remained was ash and deformed metal, Aurora stepped closer and looked down. He thinks that if he keeps enough information about a person, she whispered, he owns that person. Damian stood beside her, his shoulder about 10 centimeters from hers. Some people think so, he said. He's wrong. I know. She gazed at the ashes for another moment. Then she turned and went back inside without saying anything more. And Damian stood there a little longer, watching the dying embers, feeling the chill of the November night seep into his coat without moving. Dominic called at 2 in the morning with the first news about Preston Hale. Not the location. Nobody knew where he was, and wouldn't know for a while. But Dominic had the name of the person who had arranged Preston's removal from Hoboken, a middleman connected to the financial network Webb was building his profile on, a name on the list of 17 people Damian had given Webb 3 hours earlier. They're hiding him, Dominic said. Not killing him, just hiding him until they figure out their next move. Does Webb know? I just forwarded the information. Good. Stop. Damian, if Webb finds Preston before us, well, Webb found Preston before we did, Damian said. That was the agreement. Dominic's brief silence, the silence of someone adjusting something in their head. He's really changed, Dominic said in the end. No judgment, just observation. Damian did not deny it. Go to sleep, he said. There's plenty of work to do tomorrow. Bam. 7 days later. Preston Hale was found by the FBI at an apartment in Weehawken, New Jersey. Not by Virelli intelligence, not by violent intervention. By the routine investigative work of Marcus Webb and his team, accelerated by information provided by Damian and leading to a broader network of which Preston Hale was just one point. He was arrested at 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning. No resistance, no further escape. News broke on every media channel before 9 o'clock in the morning, not because the arrests were significant in themselves, but because Webb had cleverly arranged for 3 of the 5 foreign investors to be arrested simultaneously in 3 different locations on the same day, making it the largest financial case the Southern District had handled in 5 years. Preston Hale, in that painting, becomes a supporting character. That's exactly what Damian agreed to. Damian was following the news in his office on the 2nd floor, not with the satisfaction he expected, not with anything that could be called a clear victory, just staring at the screen with a cup of coffee in hand and feeling something release slowly and not quite cleanly, like removing a bandage from an old wound long enough to wonder if the underlying wound is still healing. Luca. He was thinking of Luca. It wasn't the first time since that night, but this time was different. Not the heaviness of unpaid debt, but something lighter and sadder in a healthier way. Remembering. Not guilt over failure, just remembering. Luca would find all of this hilarious, he thought. He would say something both ill-timed and perfectly accurate at the same time, in a way only Luca could do. He set down his coffee cup and closed his eyes for a moment. His brother died in a car on FDR Drive because a man driven by fear and desperation made the wrong decision. Preston Hale will go to jail. Not for his brother Damian, but for 12 years of financial fraud and the things in that folder that Webb handled separately as per the agreement. Not perfect. Not enough in any emotional sense. But actually, and sometimes that's really all that's left. A knock on the door. Enter. Aurora walked in with 2 cups of coffee, not a typical family gesture, not something she did because it was expected. She set 1 cup down on the table beside her and held the other, standing in the middle of the room watching the screen showing the news about the arrest. She read in silence for a minute. He didn't resist, she said. Arnott. That sounds just like him. She said it in a strange way, not forgiving, not bitter, just the observation of someone who had known the subject long enough to read character from actions. He always knew when the game was over. Damian looked at her. Are you okay? She thought about the question, really thought about it, not answered reflexively. I don't know the right word, she said finally. Okay sounds too little, and it doesn't sound quite right. She looked out the window. I feel like something is over. Not good or bad, just over. Damian nodded slowly. That's the most reasonable thing he's heard in a week, he said. She looked back at him with a fleeting glimpse of something akin to a smile. Not a genuine smile, but a precursor to it. Something that could have blossomed in the place where a smile could have developed given enough time and space. She pulled a small chair from the corner of the room, the same chair he had pulled out when he sat opposite her in her room last week, and sat down. No questions, no explanations, just sat down as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They sat in silence, watching the news on the screen until the newspaper switched to another story. Yes, 2 weeks later, Dominic placed a file on Damian's desk. The annulment procedure, Dominic said. I've had my lawyer prepare it, as per your previous request. Damian looked at the file. Before Means, before everything that happened. Before Hoboken, before Bayonne, before the pile of ashes from the hard drive in the garden fireplace. Before the mornings in the kitchen and the sleepless nights in the office and the familiar footsteps on the stairs. And money for her, Dominic said. A separate account. Enough to go anywhere and start over. Damian didn't touch the file. Leave it there, he said. Dominic stood still. Leave it there, Damian replied. I'll decide for myself. Dominic nodded and left, smart enough not to ask any further questions. He was looking for Aurora in the garden. She was sitting on a stone bench in the corner of the garden near the fence overlooking the cliff, the same spot where, during the first week, she had stood and asked Carlo about the depth of the sea. Now she wasn't standing. She was sitting, with her new sketchbook on her lap and a pencil in her hand. Draw. Not a quick sketch, real drawing, with the focus she puts into anything she truly cares about. He stood at a distance close enough not to break her, watching her work for a few seconds before she heard footsteps on the grass and looked up. He doesn't have a coat, she said. Is it cold? Just a little. She looked at him. Sit down. There were no other seats. He sat down on the edge of the stone flower bed opposite her. They looked at each other in the late November afternoon light, a low golden light at the angle of winter, the kind of light that makes everything look older and more real at the same time. I have something I need to tell you, Damian said. She put the pencil down. This marriage started the way it shouldn't have, he said. You had no choice. I didn't ask for your opinion. I used you as part of something you didn't deserve to be a part of. He looked her straight in the eyes. I can end it if you want. The papers are ready. The money is there. You can go anywhere. Aurora listened, but he said nothing. But if you don't want to go, he continued, his voice lower, and not because of uncertainty, but because what he was saying required that smallness, then I want you to know that I no longer think of this as a deal or a contract. He paused. I don't know what I thought of it as, but not those things. The wind blew in from the sea, strong enough to chill their faces and carrying the scent of salt to remind them both of where they were. Aurora stared at him for a period of time that couldn't be counted in seconds. He just told me I can leave, she said finally. Have. While it's clear he doesn't want me to leave. Yes, there is. Those are two contradictory things. I know. She looked down at the sketchbook on her lap. Looking at the unfinished drawing, from Damian's perspective, he could only see the outlines, not enough to make out what it was, but enough to see that it was something she had spent time on. "When I first walked into this house," she said slowly, "I thought this was the next prison. Nicer, bigger, but still a prison." "I know you think so." "I don't think that way anymore." She looked up at him. "Not because you're perfect, not because things are simple now, but because this is the first time in my life that a man has stood before me, asked me what I wanted, and actually waited for an answer." Damian looked at her. "And what do you want?" he asked. Not as a tactic, he was asking genuinely. Aurora Hale, Aurora Virelli, looked directly into the eyes of the man her father had offered her as a bargaining chip, the man who had placed his vest on her trembling shoulders on their first night, the man who had burned the evidence of 22 years of suffering in the garden fire, the man who had just sat down in the stone flower bed in the cold without a coat to ask her this question. And she said the first truth, which wasn't about survival strategies, calculations, or anything filtered through layers of protection. "I want to be here," she said, "not because I have nowhere else to go, because I choose to be here." Damian isn't good at moments like these. He knew he wasn't good at it. He'd lived long enough in a world where emotions were a vulnerability to be exploited, to learn how to hide them where no one could see. And what was happening in his chest right now, the uncomfortable warmth, the forbidden opening, wasn't something his language was designed to handle. But he didn't need a language for it. He rose from the stone flower bed, walked over to where she was sitting, and sat down beside her, shoulder to shoulder, no distance, no permission. And when she didn't move away, when she actually leaned slightly toward him in the manner of someone who had finally found something sturdy enough to lean on, Damian placed his hand on hers. "Don't grip tightly, don't hold on, just place your order." Just like the first time in the kitchen, except this time there was no phone ringing, no outside, nothing that required him to get up and go, just the garden and the sea below the cliffs, and the late afternoon light turning a deep yellow before fading away. 3 weeks later, Raymond Cho called with a final update. Preston Hale was charged with 14 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, and a separate count relating to records in a folder that Webb processed as agreed, confidential, without publicly naming the victims, and using victim protection procedures. Garrett Walsh cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. The Virelli syndicate records within the federal system were reclassified as evidence of dubious origin in the context of the provider facing a separate indictment, not erased, but no longer prioritized, as Webb put it. "It's not perfect," Cho said. "Nothing is perfect," Damian replied. "Webb will continue to monitor him." "I know. That doesn't worry him." "It makes me pragmatic," Damian said. "There's a difference." Let there be a moment of silence. "He's changed," he said, not like Dominic had said 2 weeks earlier, but with the colder, more observant tone of someone accustomed to assessing the risks of change in others. "I don't know if that's good or bad for the job." "Both," Damian said truthfully. "I'll call back when needed." The last night of November. The sea breeze was stronger than on previous nights, enough to hear its sound through the double-glazed windows and feel its presence as a gentle pressure on the glass. The Long Island villa on nights like this sounded alive. The creaking of the wooden frame, the waves crashing against the rocks below the cliff, the wind whistling through the disused chimney. Damian slept for the first time in weeks. Not the interrupted sleep with his phone near his hand and part of his brain still monitoring it, but a real, deep, dark, dreamless sleep. He woke up before dawn, as was his old habit, lying in the darkness with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the distant sound of the sea. And for the first time since the night he received Luca's photo, he didn't wake up with a to-do list already jotted down in his head. Not with the feeling that every moment of stillness was a wasted moment. He just lay there and listened. Dawn comes slowly in winter. The first rays of light filtered through the edge of the window curtains at nearly 7 o'clock, a silvery gray before turning to a pale yellow, the kind of light of a new day that hadn't yet decided what kind of day it would be. Aurora was standing at the downstairs living room window when Damian came down. She stood in the way she always stood by the windows overlooking the sea, not leaning against anything, back straight, arms hanging naturally, gazing out with the quiet concentration of someone listening to something inaudible to the naked ear. Damian stopped at the living room door and looked at her for a moment before she realized he was there. He looked at her shoulders, the same shoulders he had seen on their first night, bearing the scars and burns and the knife wounds of others, now concealed by a thick gray sweater that was wide enough to hide the shape underneath, but not the way she carried them. No longer hunched over, no longer trying to take up as little space as possible. Just stand. In my own space. She turned around when she heard footsteps. "The coffee isn't brewed yet," she said. Her voice was early in the morning, slightly hoarse like someone who had just woken up, and he realized he was familiar with that sound in a way he hadn't noticed until he heard it again. "I can make it," he said. "I know." She turned back to the window. "I just don't want to leave yet." He walked into the room and stood beside her by the window. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean stretched out in the early morning light. Not blue, not gray, but a color somewhere in between that, without a proper name. The color of deep water in a not yet intense light. The eastern sky began to show a pale pink tinge on the horizon, where the sun was rising from behind the curvature of the earth. "Have you ever truly regretted a decision?" Aurora asked, without looking at him, still gazing out at the sea. Damian pondered the question. "I regret more the things I didn't do than the things I did," he said in conclusion. "The times I didn't say something to Luca when I could have. The times I let the work do the answering for me." She nodded slowly. "Will he like this?" she asked. Luca. All of this. Damian thought of his younger brother. The loud, self-absorbed laughter. The way Luca always said the wrong things at the right time and somehow still managed to say the right things. "He'll have an opinion on everything," Damian said. "And most of that opinion won't be appropriate." She laughed, for the first time. Really. Not the slight smirk that preceded a smile he'd seen a few times, but a genuine laugh, short and unexpected and completely unplanned. It disappeared as quickly as it arrived. But it was there. Damian looked at her, smiled, and felt something in his chest do something he had no good words to describe except this. It moved. Something inside him moved, toward her, toward that sound, and he let it move without trying to pull it back to a safe place. "Tell me about him," she whispered. And Damian Virelli, the head of the East Coast crime empire, the man whose name was whispered in hushed tones at tables without menus, who didn't cry when he looked at a picture of his younger brother on his phone screen at 2:47 a.m. Begin telling the story. And that was the closest he had come to peace in a very long time. Outside the window, the sun continued to rise over Long Island. Waves continued to crash against the cliffs below. And inside the house built to hold secrets, two people stood by the window, letting the light in.